Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist, our Facebook Live program, where we'll answer common questions about atheism, freethinkers, and state-church separation. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. Annie Laurie and I are co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this new weekly show.
I'm Andrew Seidel, a constitutional attorney and FFRF's Director of Strategic Response. Now, if you have questions for us, please email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org or post them in the comments below, and we are going to get to them later on.
And this week we're going to talk about the Museum of the Bible, that $500 million venture by the family behind the Hobby Lobby company. And Andrew and our legal team had tracked the museum for years before it opened, ensuring it received no special treatment or public money. But last month, Dan, Andrew, and I actually visited the museum. We were masochists in the service of exposing what it's about.
So today's show is about atheists at the Bible Museum. We took one for the secular team, and we spent way too many hours at this museum. Now, if there's any place that the Bible does belong, it is in a museum. But this museum is on a different mission from other types of museums. It wants to show that the Bible is relevant, that it's influential, and that the foundation of, well, just about everything in the world, according to the museum. But Andrew, you summed up our feelings very nicely in the conclusion of your blog. The Museum of the Bible is free, but somehow it's still not worth the price of admission.
Now, given the connections that the museum has to the Greens, that's the family who owns Hobby Lobby, their Christian nationalism, and the biblical misinformation we've seen, we did not have the highest hopes for the museum. But I did want to be impressed. I wanted to learn something. I wanted to be pleasantly surprised by a fair-minded presentation of the facts. But with a few notable exceptions, however, the museum failed to meet even those low expectations.
Well, so let's look at some of those exceptions first. And Andrew, first, what impressed you?
So one of the things that I actually really enjoyed was they have a working reproduction of the Gutenberg press in the museum. Now, we don't know exactly what the Gutenberg press looked like, right? It was secretive. It was intellectual property. But they have a working reproduction with the movable type, and they were actually printing off pages from the Bible right there in the museum. Now, Dan, you had a few interesting facts you were telling me actually in the museum about the Gutenberg press itself.
Gutenberg wasn't printing the Bible for religious reasons. He was doing it for financial reasons. He was in debt. So he was hiding this press. He didn't want anyone to get a hold of it. It had never been done before. And it was probably patterned after like a wine press, which is what you see here. It looks kind of like a wine press. They don't really know. He was pretending like they were making candlesticks so they could explain why all this lead was coming into this building. Because if the church got a hold of this, they would have taken it to make a lot of money. And Gutenberg wanted to make the money. So the press probably looked something like this at the time. And what was interesting is that there was no type. He had to hire a scribe, a young man, to come in and actually physically carve the letters for each of the pieces of metal, pieces of lead that were printed onto the parchment.
Now, I like this because this is an enormous technological advance. It did revolutionize the world. But it wasn't because of the book that was being printed. Right. It was because of the technology. And the museum doesn't really necessarily make that distinction as much as we would have liked to have seen.
Well, that's where you made money in those days, selling Bibles and selling, actually, indulgences. The Catholic Church, Gutenberg was afraid that the Catholic Church would take this to print indulgences, which were like money. They could pass them out and make all sorts of money. He didn't want that to happen. He wanted to make the money.
Fair enough. Yeah. Now, the second thing that impressed me also relates to the Gutenberg press. Outside the museum, there are these two huge doors. You can see that's my windy selfie outside. That's the best shot that I got of the doors. But they are the script from the Bible put huge on like 30-foot tall doors. And that was pretty impressive. Now, the good news about that is you don't actually have to go inside the museum to see those. You can just see them walking right by. And they're not functional doors. I asked the staff, they actually don't open or close. So they're really just there for display.
Well, so that were two things. And then there was one thing that I think impressed all of us, and that is when we walked by a picture of one of our favorite people, Vashti McCullum. And I think we've got a photograph, hopefully a close-up as well.
We do.
That's the exhibit, and then there's a close-up coming up, maybe closer than that, of Vashti McCullum, who Dan and I knew. We met. She was an honorary director of FFRF. She won the first decision, the landmark decision against religious instruction in the public schools in 1948. And that's a picture of her looking at the newspaper where the headlines say she won.
And that's actually it's actually a Topps baseball card that the museum has. And I used to collect those as a kid, but I haven't been able to find anything about these. I'm going to have to write an email to the company, I think.
But actually, we have a photograph, that same photograph,
Yep.
framed, and it's on the bookshelf very prominently in the legal wing
Right outside
at
my
Free Thought
office.
Hall here at FFRF. And so it's like seeing an old friend. Vashti has died some time ago, but her sons are members of our group, and the little boy in the case who was being persecuted because he wasn't taking religious instruction, Jim, is a life member, and he's in his 80s. He's very youthful, however. He's a constitutional attorney, and he's still, they keep bringing him back.
So
to
why
do some
is that
cases.
picture and card in a Bible museum?
Well, it's interesting that they chose that case. It wasn't strictly about only the Bible, but somebody went through that museum and said, you better have something more objective. You better talk about controversies, a little bit about separation of church and state. That was
And it was a pretty minor
Hardly.
display. It was
Yes,
pretty,
very,
you could
very
see
minor.
from the photos it was pretty small. The Bible in the Supreme Court, I think, is what they...
Or
Yeah.
maybe they're
titled the
thinking
display.
that, look at the influence of the Bible in history. There was actually a Supreme Court case. It's such an influential book that people had to sue over it,
Or
maybe.
maybe they're thinking, here's a villain. Look at that villainous woman. I mean, she got terrible hate mail before in the internet. It was all by phone calls and mail, and horrible mail and feedback for winning this very important case defending the First Amendment. So maybe somebody put her in there thinking she's a villain. I don't
That could
know.
very well be.
So
But I was really glad to see her.
before we go to the bad stuff, there was one other good thing that I liked about the Bible Museum. There's a section on, was it the second floor or the third floor? There's a section on the history of English translations of the Bible. And we all read the Bible, and so it's a historical act that we're doing. Not that that's truth, but I mean, Bibles were printed, Bibles were translated. There's a history behind that. And I thought that was fascinating. The original Tyndale translation, and here's a copy of another translation of the Bible. And from a scholarly perspective, I thought that was on the plus side at the Bible Museum.
So I think we're being very nice
So
to
far.
the Bible Museum. So before you spend money on a plane ticket to go see this Bible Museum, let's talk about the things we didn't like, which was a lot of it.
Sure. So I actually had really low expectations going in. But even so, I was really excited to see some of the history, the old manuscripts that were clinging to existence, leather-bound volumes that traveled the oceans, because even if you don't agree with the message, standing in the presence of history really can be awe-inspiring. But not only is there very little in the way of artifacts, at least compared to the TV installations and all the modern flim-flam that they had there, many of the artifacts in the museum appear to be fake. They're reproductions, they're facsimiles. And they had it labeled on all these different works that they were actually not genuine. So that was pretty disappointing. I was expecting to see something more than that. Now, one of the only original works was Arnold Freiberg's portrait of Washington in prayer at Valley Forge. And this was frustrating for me to see because we know that this did not happen.
Yeah, we were all frustrated. I mean, I was horrified when we came across this. But as you say, this is on loan. This is an original, but it's on loan. And somebody, again, did go through that and vet it a little bit because, as the photograph shows, this portrays an imagined moment of prayer. But, this same portrait is on a stamp, has been put on a U.S. stamp. And what's the source of it, Andrew?
So the source is Parson Mason Weems. He was a parson. He was a religious leader. He was known for writing these pamphlets that were really outlandish. He wrote one on the evils of masturbation. And this particular story is from the Life of Washington. But it didn't appear until the 17th edition of the Life of Washington. Some something like 28 years after the event supposedly happened,
Same,
and after
same
Washington was dead.
as Washington cutting down the cherry trees, full of fables.
Exactly. It's the same book as that. And we know, historians who look at this have said, no, this didn't happen. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that this happened. And it doesn't have anything to do with the Bible.
Yeah, it's
Right.
prayer.
Yeah.
What does it why is it in a Bible museum?
But it's very iconic, and fundamentalists love it.
And it's also interesting because you know how they put that phrase, it is an imagined moment, but it's buried very deep within the display. There's another plaque next to it that actually talks about the painting first, and then that imagined moment is on the second plaque. So it's almost like they're relying on the short attention span or the cursory glance that most people are going to give this to give the impression of this great influence.
That our first president, the man who became our first president, prayed at Valley Forge. And that's what made the Revolutionary War work.
In the plaque, you almost have to kneel down. It's just this little plaque down by the floor. You would probably just miss it if you were just breezing through.
Yeah, so I think it says something about who they believe their audience to be and really the message that they are trying to get across.
Yeah.
You know, most people are going to, I think, in their minds, do a superficial pass and say, "Oh, look, see, even Washington, Bible."
Yeah.
And that's going to be it. If
Yeah.
you stop and think or stop and read all the way through, you find out a little bit more that it's not even real. So now, Annie Laurie, I know one of the things that really bothered you was the museum co-opting Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And I actually have a short video clip of you schooling a tour guide on this very subject. Now, I missed the beginning of the lesson, but you did get her to rephrase a few things.
I appreciate what you're saying. I mean, I'll certainly rephrase it. She
Criticize the Bible.
okay. Well, I mean, as you can see that we've had throughout our story a lot of examples in which people are using the Bible, interpreting, misinterpreting, or perhaps misusing certain texts to support a particular point of view.
Well, you can't really hear what I'm saying. She was very defensive, though.
I felt so proud to be a part of FFRF at that moment. I really enjoyed that.
Because
So-
why did you approach
Well,
her?
do we have a photograph of that we can show of Elizabeth Cady Stanton?
We do. We have a picture of Elizabeth Cady Stanton
let's get
with
that
this,
up,
with the Psalms
with the
display.
banner, the Bible banner in the back.
There it is.
Oh, well, and hopefully we have that's not a very good picture of me, but maybe there's a better picture of this. Is there another one coming? No. Okay, so there's this, let's go back to that picture, Bruce, of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Because I don't remember
There we are.
It's a verse from the Bible. That's Elizabeth Cady Stanton. That's a depiction
it's from
of her.
Psalm 68:11, I believe.
And then there's this verse: "The Lord giveth the word, that the women that publish the tidings are a mighty host." And when I looked up that Bible verse, and of course in the King James Version, it talks about the company that publish. There's different versions of it, but it has nothing to do with women's rights. It's all about the obedient people being ready to declare war. The passage is about the biblical God fomenting a war.
He's like a general in the
Yeah,
passage,
and
right?
these are the people following the war. It has, but if you looked at that picture, and I was hoping we had a different picture there, you would think, oh, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was inspired by the Bible, or to work for women's right to vote, or that somehow the Bible endorsed women's suffrage, and in fact, she would later write, "The Bible was hurled at us from every side," when she had the gall to ask for women's right to vote in 1848. As an agnostic, it was the feminist movement, suffrage movement was guided by non-believers, and she was a critique. She wrote a critique of the Bible, which they have a little panel of it, the Woman's Bible. Do we have a photo of that?
We do have a photo of the Woman's Bible, yes.
And if you would, it's there, but a cursory glance again, you would think from that huge picture of her with the Bible behind it that somehow this was promotional of the Bible. The purpose of the Women's Bible was to say what the Bible said about women, and it was almost, and of course, entirely negative. She was the editor of it, and she had a variety of women contributing to it, and a few of them tried to say, well, there's some verses in the Bible that are overlooked. For example, that are positive. The first verse of the first creation story that's mentioned in Genesis has male and female. He created them equally. And then, but you only heard the second verse about women coming from Adam's rib. So of course they pointed that out. Why wouldn't they? But the whole purpose of the Women's Bible was basically to critique its sexism. They didn't have that word. But, and of course, her contributions to it were so eloquent in denouncing the Bible. And she said in various ways throughout her career that the Bible and the church are the greatest stumbling blocks in the way of women's emancipation. So it's just, what mixed feelings. Here's Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the Bible Museum, but it's totally, as you say, co-opted.
So that's what you were talking to this docent about?
Well, the docent was actually, I heard her telling somebody in so many words that the Bible had inspired Elizabeth Cady Stanton to work for women's rights. Because that's what she took away from that portrait with the Bible banner.
Yeah, because if you just walk by it, the average person is going to think, oh, the Woman's Bible, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, these are good things. And
in the small print, when they had the Women's Bible, it did quote her correctly. There was a strong quote.
It's the deep dive you have to do to get to it.
So somebody went through there and said, you got to be a little more accurate, or you're going to have to put some stuff in that's objective.
Now we found so many problems with this section and with the ride that we're going to talk about in a minute that we actually wrote a letter and a memo to the Museum of the Bible that people can read. We have a link, bit.ly/Museum of the Bible, MOTB memo. So it's very easy for you to go read this. We really encourage you to go read it side by side because you cite some other great information in there about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She wrote an essay called The Degraded Status of Women in the Bible, I think.
I have 75 pages in the anthology I put together, Women Without Superstition. I call it an Elizabeth Cady Stanton reader. Just little snippets, because she wrote continually her whole life against religion. Almost everything she wrote about religion was from the point of view of women and how negative religion was. Almost every speech she gave mentioned the harm of religion to women.
Well, you found an article that she wrote for a bicycling magazine, and in the middle of this bicycling, she criticizes the Bible.
Right, I mean, because a lot of the clergy didn't want women on bicycles. They really suffered when they started the women's movement from the clerical press. She knew who the enemy was. And
this one of the sort of the founding pushes for FFRF was related to feminism and the degraded status of women.
Exactly, the fight against women's reproductive rights.
So did our letter ask for them to correct this misrepresentation?
We do ask them to correct a number of misrepresentations, including in the Washington Revelations ride. Now, this is one of those rides that's sort of virtual reality. You're standing on a platform and you're moving around and you're flying over Washington, D.C. to visit these public monuments with Bible inscriptions. But it's really unfair. And I actually found a video of the ride on YouTube. Now, we didn't film this video.
Yeah, because they didn't let you.
Yeah, and nor did we put it up on YouTube, but it's fair use for us to show you a few clips from the video since we are criticizing the ride. Now, this ride and some of the exhibits on the second floor were so bad and so misleading that we wrote that memo to the museum. And again, really encourage you to go ahead and go read that memo.
Yeah, and you can also find it
at
our website, ffrf.org, and go to the news release link, and it was March. If you can't remember the bit.ly, it's there. And Andrew, you did a wonderful memo, eight-page memo about this ride. So
and by the way, they actually charge extra for the ride.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah.
It's an $8 charge.
Don't go on it.
Don't go on it.
Don't waste your time. It's all full of misinformation anyway. Now, we're going to discuss some of the misinformation here, but you really ought to go read that memo for yourself. So the first one that we're going to look at is the Gettysburg Address and the Lincoln Memorial.
In this Gettysburg Address, President Lincoln drew inspiration from the Bible.
That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth.
So this was the one that actually got all of us to kind of look at each other. We'd never heard anything about the Gettysburg Address being informed by the Bible. And I've only found one scholarly source that mentioned this, and it mentioned these verses from John 16. That was the sole scholarly source. Now, that's really hard to read, so again, you should feel free to go check this out in the memo. But if you go back to that first one, Bruce, you can actually look, and there is no overlap between the verses in John 16 and what Lincoln wrote in the Gettysburg Address.
And it was really hard. People seeing that video might not realize what they were saying. So you want to clarify.
Yeah, they said, and they actually, they write up on the screen where the Bible verse was coming from.
They said that the Gettysburg Address quoted from the Bible, basically.
It was Lincoln took influence from it, yeah. And again, it's really hard to prove a negative, but there's absolutely no overlap here. And I really would encourage people to go read the Gettysburg Address. It's 232 words, I believe. It's very short.
We all used to have to memorize it in school.
And John 16 is one chapter of the Bible. You could do this in a couple minutes, but there's really almost no overlap. Go ahead, Dan.
Wasn't it a typo? Didn't they mean John 3:16?
Well, that's what I thought. It was so bad and there was so little overlap that I thought, well, maybe they meant John 3:16. So I compared the Gettysburg Address to John 3:16. And the only overlap there, maybe, is those three words: shall not perish, should not perish. So it's really only two words.
Well, there you go. It's from the Bible.
Yeah. It says, so the government by the people, of the people, for the people shall not perish from this earth.
Yeah, I mean, and
it is not biblical.
Absolutely not. Especially not the government part of it. So to me, it was kind of mind-blowing to see this. I don't see it. To me, it's just completely dishonest.
Yeah.
I was a little bit flabbergasted.
Because it has some of the same words in this The Bible has the word "the" a lot of times. So any document that has the word "the" in it must be from the Bible. So there you go.
And this wasn't the only one that was really terrible. The Jefferson Memorial was just as bad. Let's take a look.
In the Jefferson Memorial, we find a reference from Psalm 145, verses 17 through 19. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever.
So what are they saying?
So they said that the ride was informed by Psalm 145, I think is what they said.
The monument?
Yeah, excuse me. The memorial was informed by Psalm 145, verses 17 through 19. So you can see the verses right there.
The verse on the top is the
verse
monument.
On the top is Jefferson's, and that is from the Notes on the State of Virginia, which was 1774, I believe. And Jefferson's talking about slavery here. He's talking about basically in poetic terms about how America's penchant for slavery is going to come back and hurt them in the end, basically predicting the Civil War.
Guilty conscience there.
Yeah, certainly. But again, if you read the verses that they claim influenced Jefferson, there's just
nothing.
No overlap. I don't see how they can even make this claim in the slightest.
It really dishonest.
There you go.
But anybody on that ride would have no reason to doubt the veracity. They would just accept it.
I think they would. They paid $8 to be lied to. And the Washington Monument was also featured in the ride.
Laus Deo, praise be to God, is carved into the very tip of the Washington Monument.
So Laus Deo, or praise be to God, is carved into the tip of the Washington Monument. And then they list a verse from Psalms.
Yeah, I see that every time I walk by. I see those words inscribed up at the very tip. It's really prominent.
It's on the capstone. It's really tiny, really difficult to see. But that phrase is there. And I almost didn't research this when we were looking at it because this
sounds religious.
Yeah, it's a Latin phrase. Surely they just pulled it from the Latin translation of the Bible. But if you go look it up, this is actually what the verse says. It says, Alleluia, laudate Dominum. Those are not the same, and Dominum is not the same as Deus. Dan, Deo is God, and Dominum is Lord.
And Dominum is Lord, right?
Yeah. So it's not the same at all.
Because there's verses in the Bible that say praise the Lord, so there you go.
Yeah.
And so, but that says Deus, right?
Deo, yeah. So
praise to God.
So different. And I thought, maybe they made a typo. So I actually searched 3 different Latin translations all the way through, and Laus Deo doesn't appear in any of them.
So that inscription does not appear in the Bible.
That phrase is not from the Bible.
So another lie.
Another
but
one.
The elephant in the room here, I think, is the Washington Monument is an ancient pagan phallic symbol. It's not Christian. It's not biblical. It's not. If anything, it's praising some ancient pagan pre-Christian religion.
It's an Egyptian obelisk writ large.
Yeah. There you go.
And there's more information about where, I kind of did some research on where Laus Deo may have originated from. Couldn't find an answer to that, but there's some research in the memo about that. It was on a coat of arms, it appears in Shakespeare, but does not appear to be from the Bible.
Maybe as a typo, it should have been lousy Deo. Maybe? Do you think?
I like that. Yeah. Now let's take a trip to hallowed ground. Let's go look at Arlington Cemetery for a moment.
At this cemetery, to Major Butts, the inscription reads, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." John 15, verse 13.
So this is the cenotaph for Major Butts. He was actually a really interesting guy. He was a military advisor to 2 different presidents.
So this is what they were talking about, because we can't hear that.
Yeah, this is part of it. And he actually died in the Titanic when the Titanic went down. And this is his memorial in Arlington National Cemetery.
And he's got a rather unfortunate last name.
But what they do here, right, is they try to make this, which is a private memorial, seem like it is a government-sponsored Bible verse and cross. But if you actually read on it, it says that this stone was erected by his brothers. It says it right there on the opposite side of the Bible verse.
It's a private plot with a private message on it.
And the message is private. I think that's the point that people need to take home. And actually, all of the service members who are currently in our military and have been for years get to choose an emblem of belief that they want to go on their memorial. And they can choose a cross, or there's an atheist marker, there's a humanist marker, there's a hammer of Thor, which I might choose just for the heck of it if it were me. There's something like 70 different emblems of belief that they can choose from. So they're allowed to choose the religion that they want represented, the belief they want represented.
I hope they're allowed to choose nothing at all.
They are. And in this case, the extra quote was put up by his brothers, and it says it right there on the monument.
Spaghetti monster? Can we pick the spaghetti monster?
I don't think that's one yet.
No?
The petition for that.
But we have been hearing this, I've been hearing this since the 70s with talk show hosts, fundamentalist talk show hosts back in the day, that would bring up the Arlington Cemetery and private markers as if somehow separation of church and state would mean you couldn't put a private emblem on your own tombstone.
They do this whenever we go after crosses on public land.
Or that somehow if there is a cross on something, then that allows you to put a huge cross up in a park. They're not seeing the distinction between private speech and public speech.
But
the Arlington Cemetery comes up a lot.
But Arlington is a government cemetery. It's not a private cemetery. At least they could say that.
But that
it's kind of like the forum argument, right?
Right, but if you're buried in a city-owned cemetery,
sure,
you still can't put up a huge
But you can
cross.
see what they're trying to say. Look, here's Arlington and here's the Bible.
But they don't get
DC.
it. I'm just saying that there's this tone-deaf thing about what's private and what's public.
And they don't even bother to try to go through any of those finer points, right? They're just presenting this as at the beginning of this ride. So actually, and we should back up for just a sec, because everything we've been talking about is on floor 2 of the museum, including the ride. And that the whole floor is meant to show the impact of the Bible on America, and how America was founded on the biblical principles, and how our government needs those to operate. And this ride is really a part of that message. They're trying to show, look how relevant the Bible is. It's on all these government buildings.
And they're really grasping at straws here.
And the next straw that they grasp at is Union Station.
First stop, Union Station, where you can see many biblical inscriptions, including "The truth shall make you free." John 8, verse 32.
Okay, so John 8, verse 16. No, John 8. Anyway, the many biblical verses they reference. We'll get to that in a second. So Union Station was authorized by federal law because of its location. It's in D.C. But the design, the construction, the financing, all of that was private. So Union Station was a private building at the time that it was constructed.
They needed permission to build.
They just needed permission to build. So this is not a government building, but it's being presented as though it is this huge government influence. And it's simply not there. It just doesn't exist. There are 3 Bible verses. That's there are many references, but it's private. It's not the
and aren't
the
there
government
many
influence
other
is not
verses
there.
that are not biblical as well?
Absolutely,
Anyway.
Absolutely there are on there other than John 8. There are I don't remember if I counted all of them, but there are far more pagan references and pagan imagery that decorate the building. And again, people can look at the memo for that. Now, Charles W. Eliot was the president of Harvard at the time, and he actually chose and edited the inscriptions containing this verse. And while I was researching the memo, I stumbled onto a lecture he gave called The Religion of the Future. And you can check out the memo again for more excerpts, but he said that the authority of the Bible as a verbally inspired guide has been greatly impaired. He definitely did not think it was a book that should be dogmatically obeyed or treated, and I kind of wonder what he would think of the Bible.
But can't we at least agree that there are some Bible verses that makes sense. The truth shall make you free, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a bumper sticker that says the truth shall make you free from religion.
Yeah, so
Philip Appelman, the poet, suggested that. But it's so ridiculous because it's a private building with a few Bible verses on it, but you'd be conned if you went to this ride into thinking this is a governmental building, showing that our government's based on religion and the Bible.
Yeah.
So isn't the point you're trying to make is that they're cherry picking? Because DC overall has so much pagan imagery, but if you look here and there, you can find, oh, here's a little bit of a Bible. But if you were to look at the whole picture, it looks more like a Roman or Greek or Egyptian city rather than a Christian one.
Absolutely, and we're going to see some more of that pagan imagery in a minute. And actually, let's take a look at the part of the ride where they talk about the Library of Congress.
The Library of Congress is decorated with many references to the Bible. There is a statue of St. Paul and a quotation from Micah 6, verse 8. What doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God? There is also an inscription in Hebrew which reads, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Leviticus 19, verse 18.
So the ride neglects to mention, again, the far more massive pagan influence.
So say what they claim, though, because I don't think people can understand.
And one other thing on that last slide where they talk about Leviticus being on the ceiling, there's actually a whole panel painted right next to that about Islam. Islam is prominently featured. And Charles Eliot, who decorated Union Station, also chose many of the biblical references here.
So what is the claim? Because I can't even remember now.
Those claims are accurate. They do appear there. There's a statue and 2 Bible verses. There's actually a few more in the Library of Congress. But I mean, to me, the overall point is it really remarkable that quotes from a book appear in a library?
And again, it's just one of many, many.
Exactly.
Right?
And so to suggest that literature appears in libraries is to state the obvious. It's not to reveal some hitherto unknown biblical influence. And the last one that I think we're going to do is the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court has a carving showing Moses holding the tablets. Deuteronomy 5, verse 22.
Again, we can't. The video doesn't work here. But Dan, a few years ago, you put together something that answered one of these chain emails. It started, "Did you know?" and it was all about religious imagery at the Supreme Court, especially supposedly the 10 Commandments that are displayed at the Supreme Court. And you wrote this FAQ for our website, which is, you can find it. And so we've already debunked what was on this ride.
Well, this FAQ is long, and so we can't look at the whole thing, but there's meme is still going around. Did you know that the 10 Commandments is at the U.S. Supreme Court? As if it was influencing our laws. But if you look at the Supreme Court building, there's nothing in the design of the Supreme Court building to indicate that Congress or the architect or the designers or anybody had any special regard for the 10 Commandments. The main entrance to the United States Supreme Court has no reference at all to religion or to the 10 Commandments. And the sculptor considered many of the statutes, including the large ones that were out front. Do we have a picture of the statutes out front of the...
No.
Oh, we don't. Okay. Anyway, the sculpture considered them to be allegorical figures. In front of the building, these tablets are sometimes mistaken for Moses, but they're not. The contemplation of justice and the authority of law and the 10 Commandments expressly forbid the creation of such graven images. So these carved figures at the Supreme Court would be considered a form of idol worship under the 10 Commandments, and one of many evidences that American law ignores the authority of the Hebrew Scriptures. There are several depictions of tablets with the Roman numerals 1 through X in the court, and they're often mistaken for the 10 Commandments, but they're not. The official guides, if you visit the Supreme Court, they say that these Roman numerals on the inner oak door refer to the 10 Amendments, not the 10 Commandments.
Of the Bill of Rights.
The 10 Amendments of the Bill of Rights. Although Moses is depicted, and you can see this picture here at the Supreme Court, he's not the central figure. Look at, he's up there. Well, this is Muhammad that we're looking at now.
Well, this is Moses, and this is inside the Supreme Court.
Yeah,
too.
this is inside.
Yeah, and so this is Moses and
Muhammad. They're not above the justices. They're off above the people in the
On the
audience.
sides, yeah.
When we were there, we saw them up above, kind of to our side. And Moses is standing among a whole bunch of other allegedly historical lawgivers, such as Menes and Hammurabi and Solomon. Solomon was so wise that he could manage 700 wives and 300 concubines. Solon and the legendary Lycurgus and Draco and Confucius and Octavian and Justinian. And Moses is mixed in with Muhammad and Charlemagne and King John, the Crusader Louis the Ninth, and Hugo. And there's all these other people, John
William
Marshall
Blackstone.
and Napoleon, and many allegorical and mythical lawgivers.
And that's very significant. Mythical and allegorical lawgivers,
and
including Moses.
And the goddess Fame, the Egyptian goddess Authority, the light of wisdom, and so on. So, and then Muhammad, you can see Muhammad here. He's depicted on the other side in the Supreme Court, directly opposite Moses. He's even holding his so-called holy book, which contains Arabic letters from the Quran. The museum that we went to didn't make most of these mistakes, but it did mention that Moses' sculpture is on the back of the Supreme Court on the eastern pediment, which is above the door when you walk in. Do we have a picture of that eastern pediment? There it is. This is in the back of the Supreme Court, not the front. And next to Moses are Confucius and Solon. And these three lawgivers, if you look closely, are flanked by the tortoise and the hare from Aesop's fables. So does anybody think American law is based on Aesop's fables? So obviously, the fact that Moses appears is not surprising when he's just a small part of a larger gallery of myth and history and fables.
To do with lawgivers.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that kind of does it for our portion, but we should definitely take questions.
Yeah, well, and also I think we should go back to our letter. We did write the director of the Museum of the Bible saying that ride needs to come down now until you correct it. We haven't had a reply.
And this is we're just scratching the surface in this video too. I mean, there was so much more that we wrote about in that memo.
They're very, very serious misrepresentations.
Yeah, they have some letters excerpted from John Adams and Thomas Jefferson that were very, very poorly chosen.
Yes, and you went into that in the memo. In
Yeah,
great
there's one.
detail.
Real quick, there's one Thomas Jefferson letter that they present as, you should read the Bible, and in it, Thomas Jefferson says that separating the good parts of the Bible from the bad parts is like separating diamonds from dunghill.
Yeah, and he
Very
called,
famous quote.
And they don't mention that.
They ellipse that part out.
So he used the word dunghill. Today we would use a different word, but he said the Bible is mainly a dunghill. There are a few diamonds, and even we atheists agree.
But you got to search through the
You have
dunghill
to dig
find
through
them.
and pick out a few nice things from the Bible. But
So we have a few questions already. One is from Arthur Dunn. He said, maybe you were just looking at the wrong Bibles for the Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln quotes. Maybe other Bibles have the language. And actually, I thought of this while I was reading this. Maybe it was in other translations. So I checked the other translations. They're not there. And then I went actually and found Lincoln's personal Bible on the Library of Congress website and looked for what Bibles Thomas Jefferson owned that he hadn't took a razor to and cut up and compared it to those. I actually compared it to the page in Lincoln's Bible where they claim this influence existed, a scan of that page to see maybe he had handwritten notes, and none of it was there.
Very thorough debunking job there.
And those links are in the memo if people are interested in looking at that for themselves.
okay, but he might have been thinking those things. How do you know what he was actually thinking, Andrew?
It's true. I don't.
Yeah.
Now, Richard Halaz asks, were there any exhibits at the museum of stuff not in the Bible, such as the rapture?
Stuff that's, I'm trying to remember. I went through some of the stuff that you guys, you did something different than I did.
Well, yeah, we split up at one point because there was a lot to cover.
I went into the section where there's sort of a reenactment of some of the stuff in the Old Testament. It's real hokey. And then the New Testament. But what was odd about the Bible Museum is there wasn't a whole lot about Jesus in this section. It was the Palestinian or whatever villages, but there wasn't depictions of Jesus, and it was empty, of course. So I don't remember that, but it's possible.
Well, there's a whole children's section of the museum that we haven't talked about, which is mostly just very
Sunday schoolish.
Sunday schoolish, and it was sort of these very old, not arcade games, but like basketball and whack-a-mole type things, and half of the stuff seemed to be broken anyway.
These enactments of villages reminded me of something you'd see in a children's museum. I mean, in a children's museum, an enactment of a little village is cute. But with all the money they spent and there's aimed at adults, I thought it was really tacky.
Yeah, it could have been done better for sure.
It was like they had too much space and they didn't know what to do with it. They had this Bible, but what are you going to do with it?
So maybe we should also point out, it looks like the Museum of the Bible went to some length to include Judaism, because
Yes.
the Jews are the people of the book, you know, although I didn't see any Islam, but at least they included Judaism.
I think they were trying to entice
And
Jewish support.
do you remember that one exhibit that was showing the hatred and the censorship of the Bible? Look how the Bible has been hated and been burned and all that. And the display was kristallnacht.
Yes, I haven't written my blog yet, and I have all these photographs of the stuff like that. That was so deeply offensive. You would think that the Bible was being persecuted because Jews were being persecuted.
Well, and Torahs were
by
being burned.
By Christians who later were Nazis, who put on the buckle of their belt, God mit uns, God with us. I mean, it was Lutherans and Catholics killing Jews, and Lutherans and Catholics who were going after Jews on Kristallnacht.
But because Torahs were thrown into the street and the Torah was, the Hebrew Bible was burned, that shows hatred to the Bible in culture.
Yeah, so there were a lot of disturbing things we haven't talked about in there.
Yeah.
But I don't remember the rapture. But even though Jesus seemed to be de-emphasized in this little tour of the New Testament villages, on every floor there was a giant painting shrine to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember? And they weren't historic.
Yeah, they were
Or
like new stained glass installations.
Right,
Sure.
right.
Sure. So we have another question from Aaron Charleston. Aaron asks, how much did the taxpayers pay for this one?
We hope nothing.
We hope nothing, and to the best of we've been able to determine nothing. So we actually heard about this, I think it was back in 2014 or 13, and I wrote a FOIA request to the DC City Council to get all the records possibly relating to the finances, because we were very worried that there was going to be public money going to this. And we did that a couple times in the interim between the first one and when it opened, and none of the records we had suggested there was any public funding at all of this.
But I do want to say that we can't de-emphasize the importance of this placement of the Bible Museum so close to the U.S. Capitol. Mm-hmm. They're trying to make inroads. They're trying to be there to show that somehow the Bible is a foundational part of our government.
Mm-hmm. When you walk in, there's a big display of the names of the major donors to the Bible Museum. And from what I could see, most of them seem to be evangelical, conservative churches.
Rick Warren's,
mm-hmm. And then Prestonwood Baptist out of the Dallas area. So it had an evangelical feel to it. Did not, when you walk in, you didn't feel like there was this objective museum like you would expect somewhere else. It had an agenda feel to it when you walk in.
And they apparently were distressed that they weren't going to be able to charge money because the Smithsonian museums, which are so fantastic, are all free. So they made a decision not to charge money for that entry, although that terrible ride.
Yeah, they
cost
get you,
money.
and I think they get you on a few other rides.
And of course,
well.
and they're asking for money.
There's
everywhere.
a donation,
there's a
and then there's a
suggested
shop
donation.
where you can buy all this wonderful, beautiful stuff. Did you see the stuff in the shop?
Oh yeah, it's like Hobby Lobby in there. It's chintzy. It's
chintzy
awful.
stuff that you can,
And maybe we should briefly mention Hobby Lobby's history in entangling church and
we have a
state.
question about that real quick. So we'll do that with this question. Daniel Hunt asked, weren't a bunch of the artifacts from the museum illegally smuggled from the Middle East? What happened to thou shalt not steal? So that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Hobby Lobby and the Greens got in trouble for buying artifacts that had been smuggled out of ISIS-controlled territory. Basically, they were funding ISIS. Essentially, was how I remember the story going. So that was a pretty big concern for them.
But they took them out, didn't they? And they returned them or something.
Well, the federal government came down on them, and they ended up settling with the federal government. So yeah, they did have to ameliorate it in some way. I don't remember how exactly they did it.
But of course, Hobby Lobby is the group that's behind the very bad Supreme Court decision attacking the contraceptive mandate in Obamacare. we got a very bad decision out of that. So they're very much into entangling religion and government. We've tangled with them in the past at FFRF
Absolutely.
because they developed a Bible curriculum for the schools. And Andrew, you were working on that in Oklahoma.
It was the Mustang School District in Oklahoma, and I would encourage people to go do a little research. You can find some of the photos that we posted from the curriculum. This was one of the worst designed curriculums I have ever seen. It was so blatantly pro-Christian and trying to preach and convert children. There was absolutely no attempt to be fair-minded in it at all. And that curriculum, because of the work that we did, was not put in the public schools. It's not dead.
No, it's not dead. We would need to watch it.
Yeah, and the Green family actually took it to Israel, and they've been trying to implement it over there, and they're trying to implement it in private schools too. But they're going to use, from what I can tell, they're going to use the Museum of the Bible to try to do another push to implement it.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
we're
I'm
keeping
sure
an eye
this
on
is
it.
going to be something we'll be troubled by in the future.
I think so. So we have a question. This is also from somebody named Dan. Do they mention Kamu Makesi Tehutu's book? Apologize if I ruined that name. How to Make a Negro Christian, which is about converting slaves to Christianity to make them more compliant.
I don't think that was there. I did take pictures of almost everything, and I still have to go through it.
Well, there was a pretty extensive section on slavery.
Yes, and again, whitewashing.
Yeah, it was
history.
more the Bible promotes liberation,
Right.
and all of the abolitionists were religiously
Religious,
motivated.
and there might be something in the small print that is correct, that says something negative.
And
but
in the same
overall
vein-
impression.
In the same vein, there was a huge exhibit on the introduction of the good news to the American Indians.
How did that make you feel?
When the
Dan?
ships came over, and of course I'm enrolled member of a Native American tribe, and it always bothers me. Here they came with Bibles in one hand and a gun in the other, and 90% of the inhabitants of the continent are gone because of that, mainly from disease, but also from oppression and turning the natives into slaves.
And from Manifest Destiny.
Yeah,
The whole idea of taking
but it
over
made
the
it look
country.
like we were waiting on the shore for somebody to come and rescue us. And in fact, the Mayflower Compact had that image. Please come and help us. These savages needed the good news of the gospel. So you see that when you first go into the impact on culture.
And I apologize, Dan.
Well, you weren't there.
I have a Mayflower
Yeah,
descendant who was a tutor, not a pilgrim, but he signed it,
yeah.
George Soule.
But that was the first part of Floor 2, the impact
Yeah,
of the
the
Bible.
impact of the
Floor was
Bible
that,
on-
that first part was about the Native Americans.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we need to do a little bit more about that because there's a lot of concern that I have about the impression that someone would walk away from when they go through that.
I think that's for Dan for your blog probably.
Well, okay.
So we have another question, which is from Lauren Solinsky. Does the Bible Museum talk about the Shroud of Turin? Because that was debunked as a fake using radiocarbon dating.
No, I don't think so.
I don't remember seeing anything. But we didn't get to see the whole museum.
Yeah, I have to go back through my photographs.
We didn't get to see it, the whole thing.
I don't remember it, but the jury's out on this one. Maybe
They would
someone
have
else
had
remembers.
a facsimile of the Shroud of Turin, if anything, but I don't
I think
so.
they did stay away from it because they're fundamentalist bent more than Catholic.
Yeah.
But I can't remember.
No.
I don't recall either. I do recall while we were eating there, we were serenaded by an a cappella group singing Joshua Fought the Battle of Jericho, which I remember learning in my public elementary school at the time, and being very disturbed later on when I got complaints working here at FFRF because this sings of genocide, right? This is a song about Joshua killing an entire city of people. And it was a little
But they were really
vomit-inducing.
nice-looking, attractive, very talented
They
young
were great
people.
singers,
Good
yeah.
singers
They were.
singing about genocide. It was
Yeah.
kind of interesting. Well, that restaurant at the top floor we ate at, I asked one of the servers, is this a private thing? And he said, yeah, it has nothing to do. And most of them were Filipino. And I said, well, would you hire any atheists here? And he said, we probably have some atheists working here. So it's a totally outside group who's putting on that restaurant at the Bible
Although
Museum.
the museum is still making money off
Yeah, they're
that
making
food,
money.
but
Sure.
we were kind of trapped there.
Sure.
Well, you eat biblically themed food.
Yes, really
you
silly.
go in and there's these olives from the Mount of Olives, that kind of
Well,
stuff.
some fundamentalists' idea of Middle Eastern Jewish food.
Yeah. No manna from heaven. Something was named that, I believe.
That might have been the dessert. We didn't have it.
Well, that touched on the last question we have, so I think that does it for our live questions. So I think that does it.
I don't recommend it. There are so many wonderful museums, and the African American Museum that's just opened, the Native American Museum, and all the other museums.
Just
worth your time.
Just walk 2 blocks to the National Museum of the American Indian, and that's worth every penny of the free admission. I mean, that's great.
Well, that's what I wrote in the blog. An atheist visits the Bible Museum, but I think it's worth repeating. The Museum of the Bible is free, but somehow it's still not worth the price of admission. And you can stay tuned to the Free Thought Now blog for An Atheist Visits the Bible Museum Part 2, that was a tongue twister, and An Atheist Visits the Bible Museum Part 3, which will be Dan and Annie Laurie's individual takes on it.
Yeah, so we've only scratched that surface, and we do encourage you, if you go there, to have a skeptical eye, but again, it's not worth the visit. But next week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist will certainly be worth it. Dan will be discussing the top 5 contradictions in the Bible. So please be sure to join us next Wednesday at noon Central for another edition of FFRF's Ask an Atheist.